So let us pray. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Heavenly Father, as we get ready to search about the temptations in our life, help us, Lord, to find the courage and the strength we need to fight temptation, to live the holy and devout life. But through the intercession of Saint Francis de Sales and all the saints on this day, may we grow in holiness and hope to see you one day. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, sorry. So for those online, you're going to have to look at me a lot more often because because I usually start with where I left off, and then I build the slides from there. So what I must have had is the old one, because this says part 4. So I start there, and then I start adding all the slides, and they're not there now, and they're not upstairs on my computer either, which means they must have cross-synced, and the old one took over the new one. So anyway, because I was looking on here, that's okay, because it just means it's going to challenge me to make sure you get my ideas in a real way. All right? So let's start again. We'll start where we left off, because I do have things from the slides right here, and I got my notes right with me. So anyway, the first thing we're going to finish off in chapter 3, third part, and we begin with being faithful in small things. And he says you got to be ready to do small things for the Lord. You know, to be a lot of people for whom when I'm doing spiritual direction with them, they want to do the grandiose things. I mean, I want to help the poor. I want to really do these great things. And he says you got to be patient, being just patient with the annoyances and discomforts and the unimportant losses that come to us every day. You know, like accepting the loving and freely, the headaches that you have, the toothache that you have, the cold that you're dealing with, peculiarities of your husband or your wife, and tolerating that. He says a broken glass that you had or a ring that you lost. He says the sneer of a neighbor. You need to accept these things lovingly. That's the beginning of a devout life. Oftentimes they're like, I want to do something great. You want to do something great? Then put up with your husband. That's the great thing. Put up with your wife. Right? That's the thing you do. Everybody wants something great. They want to help the poor. I think we get these grandiose ideas. And he says, dedicate everything that you do to God, no matter how small it is. That's the beginning. And you get this with Saint Teresa of Lisieux in the Little Way, Mother Teresa. You want to help the poor? Here's a broom. Like, no. I mean, I want to hold a dying person in my hand. I'm not going to sweep the floor in a room. But that's really what happens in the spiritual life. It's the being faithful to the small things he wants you to be. And so you seek the higher things of faith, so many people, but you neglect the little things of the day and the family cares that you have. I remember saying, I think I want to do mortification, I mean, I'm going to do like this great fast. But you know what? The real prayer the real kind of penance is to be faithful to the bravery and the prayer life I have. Oh, no, that's not, I want to do something great. Like, well, you know what? Then do morning prayer. No, something really great. But that's right, just do morning prayer. That will be the great thing. There'll be great occasions to serve God, but they're very few. But the little ones come all day long. All day long. If it's done in God's name, then all you do will be well done, he says. That's what you do. And then he says some people, they find fault with their neighbor, right, very readily for a small matter, and then pass over the great things that are in ourselves. It's like, really? So you're going to criticize them about that? Have you looked at yourself lately? And that's a challenge that we have, especially. We always want to do things that are often for our benefit, but yet we criticize when someone does the very same thing. For me, the classic thing for me is that if I know that the lane's going to be closed ahead, right, and I get some space, it's just so I race my car up to the front and then squeeze in, right, and there, good, I got in, right? But if I'm back there and I see someone else do that, boy, does that make me mad, right? Who does he think he is? Here we are, we're all in line, and and it's like, but you do it for yourself, though. Sure, there's a lot of things that we criticize, he says, about things. Like for some people, is like, yeah, if you're in sales, it drives you crazy when somebody's always looking for a deal. Until you're trying to buy something, and you're always looking for a deal. Right? And so that's one of the things he talks about. He says how you always want to buy something, at the cheapest price, and yet when you want to sell something, you always want to get the highest price, obviously, right? He said, but we're often eager to deal with the strict things of others, and then seem sometimes to obtain he says, the indulgence of ourselves. And he gives a whole bunch of examples about how we seem to do things that make us mad when other people do it, and yet we sort of forgive ourselves or give reasons why we ourselves don't have to do it. And he says there can be usually two scales, one for your own advantage and for your own benefit, and then one for the disadvantages of others. And the challenge is that classic thing is, even if someone were to do that, when you do it, like something like racing through a red light. I have all the driving examples. Racing through a red light, right? Which you're great, you made it. But then, when you're waiting at the red light and someone races through the red light and yours is green, you're like, look at that guy. Look at him. He's racing right through the red light. So he says, be just and fair in all that you do and put yourself in the neighbor's place. That's the devout life. In the neighbor's place, and sell and buy and engage in the world as you would want to be done to you. So, all right? Then he also talks about in the wishes. This is a tough thing for a lot of people, for all of us. In the devout life and growing in spirituality, we often long for things that are way beyond what is possible for us. And that we waste a lot of energy and we have distractions about wanting something that we cannot have. I deal with people who are in the married life and they think about wanting to be a religious. Like, it's not possible for you. This is not, so stop thinking about that. If only I'd done that. If only I'd done that. Right? They want this property that's for sale, but it's not going to be sale for them. And he talks about how we can waste a lot of our energy. And to do that, Tom, I remember when I was vocation director, this, 70-year-old man, because we were doing a retreat, we're in the stairwell, and he says, I always thought I should have been a priest. He says, I tried, I said, you need to stop thinking about that. That door was closed. It's done. You're wasting energy in that. And he says, in a devout life, don't waste energy on things that are not possible. They won't be possible. And chances are, you would do so much better if you strived after things that were possible. And then he says that for someone in these wishes, another trap we fall into is like when we are sick, we waste time about being anxious of all the good things that we could be doing if we weren't sick. Right? And he says, and then when you have something where you have no power to fulfill it, well, if I had the power, I would do this. He said that it's useless wishing, and instead what you need to do is be patient and resign yourself to the reality in which you live in, and live that reality in holiness, rather than all of the times and things. And and I remember for myself thinking about that, about one of the curses that we have, one of the great things we have as a gift, as a human being, is to romanticize, is to think about a possibility. And it often is times, it can be a curse as well. Because when you're going through a situation, I'll use a married couple, you can use a priest, the same thing. In your case, you romanticize what life is going to be like, right? Otherwise you wouldn't get married probably if you knew what it really was going to be like, right? Isn't that true? So, but then you romanticize that. And then what often happens, I think, anyway, for us too, for me as well, is that as the one who was an accountant, I used to romanticize once when priesthood was a pain and the people were a pain, I would romanticize how wonderful it was when I was an accountant and how I could just do my work and I could go home, right? And I didn't have this constant used to be nice, right? I mean, maybe that, and I think that's what happens when people go through a crisis in marriage, or when they were romanticizing a reality that's not true. It's not there. And I said, and I remember thinking in the spiritual life, there was a time I had that life, and it wasn't fulfilling. And there was a time I was searching for more. And if I go back there, that search will come back again, and I'll have that desire. And I think that that's true for all of us. When we're going through a struggle, we romanticize. It's so easy to romanticize something else. When you're in a parish that's not as great as it was, it's romanticized something that was. This is not the way it is. You oftentimes make decisions based on that, only to find out that where you went was not reality. You know, when the people in Egypt left Egypt, it was tough in the desert. It was terrible in the desert. And what did they romanticize? They romanticized the flesh pots that they had. You know, the food that they had, as they said. And you turn around and say, but, do you remember you were enslaved? You know, you wanted out. You cried to the Lord to get out of that situation. And now that you're in another situation where it begins to be trying, you romanticize a time of slavery as if it was beautiful. And you'd long to be back there, but you're free now. And that has to be worth more. And that we can do that in marriage. I think a lot of people, when dealing with annulments, you know, when life was tough at home, rather than, as my own spiritual director used to tell me, work through it. Work through it. Instead of working through it, you romanticize something else and you make decisions based on that false image. And then you find out, what did I do? Why did I do this? You know? So he's saying that it's very clear, useless wishing takes the place of being patient, resigning yourself, self-denial, learning to be, building character, being obedient and gentle under suffering and difficulty, which is required, he says, of any part of life. And he said, and I remember this too, my own experience now, is that when things were tough, you have the flight or you can fight, right? And then part of the fighting is learning. What do I need to learn through this difficulty? You know, and that's so important in the spiritual life, is to learn through this cross. There's going to be a resurrection, but I got to live through this. And it's not going to be pleasant, but if I run, I will take all my stuff with me and still have that baggage. We say when I was dealing with seminary in the faculty, one of the things that happens when guys come to seminary is they bring their junk from home into the seminary. So if they've had difficulties, insecurities, and all of that stuff. And the seminary is supposed to build them and form them so that they work through these issues. So what happens in seminary is that we begin to see things like, you know, you're pretty self-centered. You got to be a little selfless. And what do? They get all mad, right? We all get mad when people criticize us. And I remember one of the advisor I had when I was in seminary and it was being happened. He said, "Is it true? If it is, look at it and deal with it." But what would happen is that guys would get all their back up and they were really angry, and they would leave, right? And they would say, you know, and they would call us names for challenging them, right? Which would happen in real life, but for everybody does that. And I would say, you know what? Pack up all your baggage and all the things, and your angriness, and your cynicism, and move on with your life. But I'll tell you what, you probably could have helped if you stayed with this, to go through what it means to get over cynicism or anger or fear and work through it. But instead you ran and you took all your stuff with you and you never got that chance to grow through that. And that's why I think it's, for him, it's like, deal with what you have now rather than wishing that something other life would have been better if you had that life. And instead you're stuck in this life, so to speak. He says you can never think that one's vocation is a clear waste in time. It can be a clear waste of time when not accepting your situation and just wishing for something different manner of life that you adopted as a duty. So you don't desire any difficult cross or anything like that, except the ones that God gives you. Those are the ones you accept, is the one He gives you. And other people would love to pick up all kinds of other things, especially once they start growing in the spiritual life. He said the enemy of the soul often inspires men and women to desire things that are not attainable and divert their attention on the things that are right in front of them, which would profit them much better. So anyway, in the end, don't waste your time on unprofitable wishing. And then he had counsels for married people. I think I let you guys do that, look at that, because you can kind of take it. One of the things that he does talk about is that mutual love, that God gives you one another to cherish one another as a sacred heavenly love, and that these heavenly loves belong only to each other, and it is not something that you freely give to other people, right? And I think that our world doesn't believe that, because you watch TV and by the time someone gets married, they must have had multiple partners making their decision about which one they would pick. But obviously we're living in a very different time, which probably should still be around, I think anyway, where this is this, inviolable fidelity to each other. And so he is, during his time, it was the beginning of seeing marriage less as a contract between two parties and two families, to beginning to see, which for us would be fine, the union of hearts. That has not always been the idea that that's what marriage was about. But now, as we're getting into the 17th century, we're beginning to see that marriage is now about, fidelity to one another and the union of hearts, and not just a contractual agreement between two families, which you would have had. So you start seeing this thing about there's husbands having this tender, constant, hearty love for their wives. All right, and that there should be never no jealousy in marriage. So he gives that kind of, and same thing with the wives, So, and one of the things I really like, he said, as a family, as parents, as soon as your children can reason, which we say is the age of 7, you must fill their hearts with faith. That's your job as parents. As soon as your children can reason, to fill their hearts with faith, he says. And building up your family. All right? And the one advice he gives at the end is, on your anniversary, you should go to Mass. On your anniversary, go to confession, commend your life, your married life to God, and renew your resolution in your vocation. That's what he says you should do. I don't know how many of you did them on your anniversaries. You all went to morning Mass because it was your anniversary. Anybody here? Yeah. Oh, good. You went to Mass on your anniversary? That's wonderful. Back there. Great. We got a couple of, hopefully some of you online. That's what you should do. Go to confession on your anniversary, right? And renew your spiritual life in your relationship with God. It's funny that you would think that would be what a priest should do, but that's my vocation. It should be yours as well, right? And so anyway, and of course for him, the sanctity of the marriage bond, his advice is the marriage bed should never be undefiled. And then he gives counsel to widows. He says, widows, your first idea, if any of you are widows here on online, is to focus on your faith now. That prayer is your chief occupation. But if anybody needs to get remarried because they're lonely, you shouldn't disparage them, he gives. But he says that true widows should abide in the church, just like St. Anne, and in the scriptures, who that after she'd been wiped, that now she gives her life to prayer and simplicity and kindness, humility. All right, and then maidens as well, to focus on God. All right, so we're all set. Now we can get into the new stuff, and I have no slides for this. I'm really sorry. By the way, I did have these, I just didn't use them. Okay. So anyway, no more slides. It's me you got to look at. All right. So one of the things that he talks about is now the world. We are moving out of the character and the kind of person you should be, and we're going to deal with temptation. And that's what he is focusing on now. He said, the worldly friends, just be careful, worldly friends will not be kind to you when you start on this journey of the devout life. I want to make that clear. And I think this is hard for people, because they think that if they grow in spirituality, that everything will be lovely. And he's like, if you have worldly friends, you can trust that even your own spouse, if you start this drop, they will tell you that you can be saved without all this fuss. You don't need to be this religious. You don't need to be this devout. He says right away, worldly people don't even speak of worldly, things as being unhealthy. But what I love is that if you were to get up an hour earlier every morning and pray every morning, and you make that commitment, and your spouse thinks it's crazy, but if you said that I'm going to get up every morning an hour earlier and exercise, because they're like, oh, that's wonderful. Worldly thing, he says, one of the things is like, if you said, I'm going to spend my night in prayer, a couple of hours an hour before I go to bed, and they would say, that's crazy. You don't need to do that to be holy or any of that. He said, but, he says, if you spent that hour out night dancing, that's no problem. No problem. Go out, party, stay out late all night, that's one thing. He said, but if you want to spend all that time in prayer, you must be sick. He said, they're going to tell you got to be sick, right? Because, and get ready for that. He says, the world is an unkindly judge to the spiritual person starting on a devout. It's unkindly in that they would indulge in all kinds of things of their own, but they would be very harsh and uncharitable to those who want to do anything spiritual, even though it wouldn't even be the same amount of time, says, so if you're going to change your life, be attentive to the discomfort and the feelings of discouragement and weariness in the spiritual life. Is that first you may suffer somewhat from what you enjoy. You used to enjoy it, and now you feel like I can't enjoy that anymore. That's the beginning of trying to get detached from things. And he says, and you'll want to have them back. So if all of a sudden you say, you know what, I am no longer going to watch something on the internet that's inappropriate. He said, if you begin to do that, you will feel that pull back and that call back to that worldly part. He says, you will see one day of devotion and faith is really worth more than that worldly life. That's what he promises. But he wants to make sure that we recognize that we're all beginners. And so you have to be careful and be good to yourself and not get frustrated. He said, because if you do, you will get discouraged way too quickly. And that's what he's always afraid of, that people will get, that when they start, they have all this fervor, but once the heat of the sun comes in the day, that they back off way too quickly. And he said, because they feel the lure of the world back. And he said, just recognize that's going to be part. And that's why his introduction into temptation, because you will be tempted. And he says, there is a very difference in temptation and the difference between experiencing them and consenting to them. And people have a hard time with this. He said, there is no blame with being tempted. Some people confess that they're being tempted. And he said, there's no sin in being tempted. He says the pleasure felt in temptation is usually the first step in consenting to them. So he says, keep your first resolution. And it doesn't matter how you're being tempted. So recognize that. And he says the soul has two parts, and an inferior one and a superior one. And the inferior one wants to take pleasure in that temptation. And we know that. And one of the slides I had was, there are some people who like to be tempted, like one of the easiest ones to pick up, and it's harder to pick some of the ones, but the easy one is like flirting. There's some excitement in the flirt, in the attention that you get. However, that kind of temptation, he said, begins to be your fault. Because now, in delighting in it, you are now causing and you're leading yourself into temptation. And that's why it's very important for him to, in that temptation, is to recognize, he says, there's no fault in being tempted unless it's your fault you're being tempted, right, by our own actions. And a lot of it is kind of the excitement and the lure, and they talk about in baptism, we talk about the lure of evil, that whether we like it or not, most, we think of terrible sins of like killing someone, and that would not be pleasant or anything like that. He said, but the lure that has in most things of being tempted. There's some satisfaction, even in losing your patience and screaming at someone in the beginning. You get that kind of that rush that happens, right? So anyway, he said, so there's no blame in being tempted, but as long as you didn't consent to the temptation and you didn't cause it in the first place. God's always present, and He will help. He promises He will help you to be able to resist it when you turn to God in temptation. And that's one of the things we usually don't do. We don't turn to God because we know what God's going to say. We know what God's going to challenge us with. So that's the last thing we want to do when we're in the facing of temptation. And so we'd rather consent. We know that we all deal with that. And if you don't, then you are holier than thou. That's for sure. Because the very essence, he said, of the perfection of heavenly love is to require its lover to endure the fight for the love's sake, without knowing that it possesses the love for which they and in which they strive. So he said the very essence of perfection is that heavenly love. Right? And repeat that. Heavenly love, to require its lovers to endure the fight. That this is part of our love relationship with God, is that fight with temptation. So he says, his remedies for the great temptation is to run away from temptation. If it comes, don't consent to it, don't give it any attention, just move on and run away from it. And he says, if they still persist, he says, now this is for a person of faith, you embrace the Holy Cross he gives you, and look solely at Christ, and do not fix your eyes on the temptation. It's amazing that some people who they obsess about the things in the spiritual life that tempt them, and he's saying, get your eyes off of that. And I'm like, don't even worry about that. Move on. He says, divert your mind with any other healthy occupation. And we're thinking about these in our own temptation. This is advice to kind of deal with it when you are tempted. Speak of your temptations, he says, to your spiritual director. Don't keep it secret, because as soon as you keep it secret, it has a lot of power. Once you tell it to your spiritual friend or whatever who you can confide in, that it loses its power when it speaks. And he says, don't flirt with temptation. And then what they mean by that, or, when you have a discussion, and you prolong your time in this temptation, and you give it all kinds of attention. Shouldn't, what do you think? It's not that bad. You go in and he says, don't have that discussion. Say exactly what Jesus said. Get behind me, Satan. Get behind me. So, anyway. Temptation is a thing when you start the spiritual life, because you will have the world's, whether you like it or not, whether you agree with this or not, it's true. The claws of the world are in us because we've been formed that way. And as you remove them, they're not going to let go very easily. It's not like they're going to say, hey, no problem. You've got them in you. They're part of who you are. And that anybody who's tried to change anything in their life, they know that experience. They know that experience of constantly, and the classic one, obviously the easy one, is always alcoholism, because they have defined that experience. They know it. But sometimes they're like, well, I'm not like that. But even anger. It's amazing people confess that they're angry, and then they spend the next 10 minutes justifying why they should be angry. And I'm like, why are you playing with this sin? If you believe it's a sin, you're confessing it. Why are you trying to justify it? Anyway, those are the big things that are being we're tempted about, right? He talks about these are the great things. He says, but we have these little temptations. And he said, there are many more little temptations which are just as important as resisting as the big one, if you're interested in the devout life now. And I will love this. He says, and I had a picture of a wolf or a bear. I had a bear. He says, a bear is much more dangerous than flies. Right? He says, but flies worry and annoy you and try your patience a lot more than a bear ever will in your life. And so someone's like, I'm not tempted. I love my wife. I would never have an affair against my wife. because and there's the big ones. But what about the little temptations that you have against your wife? And so I had a picture of a bear and a man running away from a bear, and then a man standing there with a lot of flies in his face. And he's trying to swat the flies away. And he says, those are the little ones. They try your patience. And now remember, we're talking about something on a devout life. So we're not talking about someone who wants to do I just need to follow the 10 Commandments? We're talking about someone kind of slip into heaven is what I'm looking for. We're looking for someone who's looking for something holy. He says it's a lot harder to abstain from murder, but much more difficult to avoid fits of anger. Right? He says it's a lot easier to abstain from adultery, but less easy to abstain from words or glances that are disloyal to your spouse. He says a lot easier to abstain from stealing, right? But a lot harder to abstain from coveting what someone else has and wanting it, not being satisfied with what you have. He says it's a lot easier. This is one of my favorites because this is one most people can deal with. It's a lot easier to avoid lying, but it's very difficult to be perfect in truthful conversation and always saying the truth, not exaggerating, He says it's a lot easier to keep from getting drunk than it is much more difficult to stay sober all the time. He says it's a lot easier to not wish your neighbor's death, but a lot harder to not wish him wrong. Never would I wish that he die, but I hope he pays for what he did, right? Right? It's a lot easier to keep from slander, but very difficult to avoid all contempt and bad thoughts of someone. He said, these are the perpetual trials of the most devout. And he said, be prepared to engage in those temptations. Right? So, and that if you're in devout life, and there are a lot of things that I think the world excuses now that we would have always thought would have been inappropriate. All you have to do is read comments on Facebook or, on YouTube and think, this is so inappropriate for dialogue. And yet it's considered norm now. Even now you start watching even like MSNBC, Fox News, CNN, all these news, even the things they say in these commentaries, it's like, I would have thought that should be inappropriate. So he says these minor temptations flit around you all the time, like flies or gnats, or for us, black flies. Just get everywhere. He says settling on one's nose or stinging one's cheek. The best resistance of this, he says, of these little temptations, is to not fret over them. And that's what people do. He says they cannot harm you if your will is to firmly serve God. Let them buzz around your ears as much as they please, even if they annoy you. But don't fight them or argue with them. And this is what I always try to give as advice. I learned it years ago, and I was so happy to be reminded. Maybe I even learned it when I read it here years ago. You never know where you learn some of these things. But he says, do the opposite. When I have someone who comes into confession and they say, I gossip. All right, I'm going to use that up. Gossip. I say, okay, well, if you want to stop gossiping, then rather than just focusing on I can't gossip, now do the opposite virtue and accentuate that virtue. So now say good things about people. Talk about all the good things that are happening. And you won't have time left over to do those other things. And that's what he gives us as advice. He says, if you find yourself impatient, then do a lot of things that help you be patient so that you can continue to be patient. And I think we've kind of forgotten that. You can make choices in your life that accentuate the opposite of what you are always kind of dealing with. People say, well, I always have the same sins. And I'm like, well, you can do something else, right? You can spend your energy doing something else. And I have to admit, it does change you. Now, you will forever deal with this stuff. It's not something that's done. But he says, don't fight or argue with them. Don't obsess, because there's a lot of energy that gets spent. The same thing, people say is, as an aside in terms of prayer, if you've been with me, you've heard me say this before, but St. Teresa of Avila, when we read the Interior Castle, deals with this idea of distractions in prayer. And people, they get so distracted in prayer. And he said, if you're going to obsess about this, the devil has won in distracting you. Rather than just saying, I'm distracted, I got to call myself back to the Lord, and gently call yourself back to focus again in prayer. And whatever it is you were thinking of, you offer it up. And you don't get excited over these things. And then, so he says, go to Christ to the safe place, which is always offensive to the one who's tempting you. All right? So how do you strengthen your heart then against temptation? He gives some examples. He says, examine from time to time, what are the things you're dealing with? What are your dominant passions of your soul? In thought, word, and deed. So that you can begin to work on it. What are the things? So from time to time, you deal with that. He says, and if you're disposed to be vain, let's say, think highly of yourself. He says, then from time to time, you set on a devout life to reflect on the emptiness of life. That all is vanity. He says, do as many humble deeds as you can, even if you don't want to do them. You do them anyway. He says, it will help you form a habit. This is like classic Aristotelian habit forming. You will start that. If you, trust me, if you say you want to be patient, I'm going to be patient with my spouse who's losing his faculties. Right? Because that happens all the time. You hear that. And I'm like, well, find a habit of being patient, man. To be patient with him. We know it will happen. It'll happen, and it might happen to you as well. And the more you form the habit of being patient, rather than dealing with being impatient, he said, the more you will become patient. You will become a patient person by being patient. You will become an honest person by being honest. Right? That's the way you do it. They think they try to do it somewhere else and something else. And it's amazing how some people, they think they're an honest person, but they lie all the time. Oh, no, I'm honest. I'm like, no, you lie all the time. It's like, well, yeah, but he did this, but he's a good man. And I'm like, no, that's what not a good man does. It's not good men who do this. I always say that all the time. He does it, but he's good. Like, well, yeah, but he beats me, but he's a good man. I'm like, no, he's not a good man. That's a definition of a not a good man, is one who beats up his wife. Do you see? But he's a good man. I'm like, so I think what happens is that flipping it on the other direction is that you become, when you accentuate the opposite virtue and you become that virtue, he said, then those other things will not carry the same kind of weight that you have. But remember to be patient with yourself. All right? Anything else? Any questions? The next one's a big one. It's anxiety. It's a difficult thing that people deal with. And he starts off this section on anxiety by talking about sadness that comes. And when we get depressed, we get sad, we get lonely. Right? And he says, if it's done out of love for God, but patiently, gently, humbly, and calmly, to go to God's goodness and providence than to one's own effort. So he's like, okay, so if we begin to feel this way, there's a lot of energy in trying to get ourselves out of it. Right? And that's what the world wants to do. And he says, the first thing you do, out of love of God, if you feel yourself with anxiety or loneliness or depression, he says you go to God's goodness first, then your own efforts. And he says, if it's self-love, you'll grow eager to seek relief, depending more upon yourself to get at this than to God. And there's a lot of people where I wonder if they really believe in the grace of God. It's like, okay, the first thing you know is, well, go to God first. You may not think it, but of his actions as though, so if I say, well, and he said, but his actions show it. And that's what he means by that. Somebody who's experiencing it, they may say that they go to God and God's grace. He said, but their actions don't show they think that. And if you were at the homily this weekend, I was talking about that in terms of love. It's like, one of the things you do is you ask people around you, because your actions reveal what it is you really do believe. So someone can't say, well, I believe in God. I'm like, yeah, but would everybody around you say you believe in God? Because do your actions show that you believe in God? They should know. And he says, in this way, too, when someone, is saying that they go to God for help, it's like, do you do that? Do your actions show that? Because what happens sometimes, if he doesn't find that, what he wants at once, if this doesn't get fixed at once, we become impatient and in trouble, and which makes things a lot worse. You get into even to greater anxiety and distress, because when we don't get what we want right away, at once, especially if God's not healing us right away, at once. He said that this unrest, though, and anxiety that comes, and loneliness and depression is some of the greatest evil, he says, which can happen to the soul. Now, we've got to take this in context, because he's speaking because we would say, oh, that's all. He says, except sin, because sin is worse. But he says, anxiety, he says, what it does, if our hearts are disturbed and anxious, it loses its power to stay in the graces that it needs. And that's why I think when you take a look at Martha and Mary's story, and Martha's in there banging on the pots, it's not because Mary didn't help it, but Jesus says, Martha, Martha, you're anxious. You are worried about a lot of things. And it disturbs the soul to be anxious and worried about a lot of things. And he says, and that's what gives the evil one a lot of power to tempt you in those times of anxiety and anxiousness and depression. And he says, almost like he says to fish in, he says you're almost ready to fish in troubled waters. When he talks about, that's when things are stirred up and difficult. And he says anxious comes from some part of us that's unregulated, a desire to be delivered from whatever it is we're dealing with. And this is what the image I had, which I had on the line, which I loved, and it made me think a lot about that. In anxiety and anxiousness, it's like, he says, it's like a bird that is caught in a net. And it's hard to untangle, because they flutter and struggle as much as they can, and they can't get out. And it's causing even more anxiety. And I think we all know that experience. And in the face of this, especially for the devout life, when one begins to experience that, his recommendation is to keep calm. To fight when you're caught in a net and keep fighting, he said, is not going to get you out of it. And it reminds me of a lot of examples in our life. One of them is like, especially when you've got, something that's all tangled up like cords, and you get frustrated, and you know that what you need to do is just stop and take your time and undo them. But what we do is we just grow in that anxiety, and it makes things even worse, and it pulls it even tighter. And he says, steady your judgment, calm, be restful, and your judgment, and he said, and your will, and go quietly into the faith to begin to deal with it. And that's why for the devout life, when one begins to feel that becomes his recommendation, that's when you need to pull. And he says, tell your confessor, but what's also important is that this is time to kind of to step out of it, right? And we know that, right? We know that instinctually. I think we've been given that as advice. When we are hot and angry, don't stay there. Get out of that situation. When we're conscious that we're growing in anxiety, he said that's the first time you begin to commend yourself to God and take the steps away from that, to quiet the mind, to begin to feel it. And yet I think that's what happened. Those who shoot a comment out very quickly, right? And it's like, could you stop and think about what it is you need to do? This is not rocket science, but it's part of the devout life that when you begin to read it. There's more for you to read in there. Now, in sadness and sorrow, when somebody's sad, he says, when you're sad and sorrow, there's sorrow in your life, he says it can be good because it can result in repentance, right, and mercy. We begin to show mercy. But he said that there's some part of sorrow in our lives that's not good. That is very dangerous because it increases temptation. He says, when there's sorrow because of, and he lists 6 of them in particular. He says, because of anguish or sloth or anger or jealousy or envy or impatience. And then he says that creates a kind of sadness or sorrow in the person. He said that's when someone becomes very tempted. The evil one can make sin and temptation very attractive because somebody's in a very difficult and low situation in their life. And when they're low in their life, they can be tempted by a lot of things. And that's when holiness in the devout life seems like awful, like something you want to run away from. He calls it disagreeable, and so you want to keep from anything that's of God in that moment. That's what they said. He delights in that kind of melancholy because it's then that you're very susceptible to giving in. So he says, when you're attracted with these, he gives you 10. And that's what's hard because I can't put them up on the line. But you can find them all yourself. He says, when you're attacked by sadness, he said, these are the 10 things you should do. He said, first, obviously, pray to God, right? And trust in Him. Resist all tendencies, he said, toward the sadness, the tendency to move in that direction. And this is what he gives. He says, if you're sad and you're sorrowful, sing hymns. The Spirit, start singing. This was his recommendation. I thought it was kind of cute. Not very basic. Start singing hymns and canticles and songs, spiritual songs. And then he said, which is, I think, so true. I try to tell this. Do something. Do something good for someone. Right? Try to tell that. Even though it's tasteless at the time and you hate every moment of it. He said, he's not even asking you to like or want to do it. You don't do what you want. Do it because it's good. So if you're at a time, he said, that, and I used to tell it to I remember hearing that from a book I read from a bishop one time. And he's like, when people are depressed or sad, now we're not talking about clinical depression, which is something different, obviously. But we're talking about in the spiritual life. He said, want to get out of it, his recommendation is go do an act of charity. Go help the poor. Do something out for something, external works, he calls it. Even if you hate every moment of it. He said, and then, of course, embrace the crucifix. And then moderate, he said, bodily discipline to stop the mind from thinking about itself. So some people do something like, go exercise, do something, he's saying. Because this is going to be part of the spiritual life. He said, frequent communion, go to Mass. Tell what's going on to your spiritual director in all humility. And he said, and find some good friends. Now, and then place yourself into God's hands. This is not rocket science. You could go Google this, how to get out of a funk, and the world would tell you a lot of these same things, right? And to me, it just goes straight. This is basic human. When we talk in seminary, we talk about formation, and we have the spiritual, human, pastoral, and intellectual formation. And one of the things that we realize that we take is that the spiritual life, the church says, is built on a good, solid human formation. You have to be a good human being. So it would be very clear that he wouldn't have all of this kind of like pie in the sky idealism that I hear people like drippy devotional saccharine kind of things, when really, really it is, you know what? Go out and do something good for someone. Why don't you go help out at the soup kitchen? That will get you out of a funk. It really will. It changes your mind. But they're like, no, I don't feel like that. I have no time to do that. I have no energy. Like, well then, what do you want me to do? Just stay in it then. What can I, because you give a lot of times you give a lot of advice. You say, this is what you do. This is what everybody says to do. Not just the church, not just spirituality. And yet, it's hard for for people because they've so bought it. But what happens oftentimes is you need to know this before you get in those situations. So that's exactly what I got to do when I see it coming. All right. So anyway, some people will balk at that, but I think it's very true. So one of the last things I just want to talk about, just so that we get to that, and we're going to be done the last class. We got one more class. So if you're not caught up in the reading, that's all great. That's fine, because I think this book should be a lifetime companion. It's one of those books I was telling somebody you read every January, a New Year resolution. It's not something you read. This is not like a novel. It's meant in the spiritual life, and as you experience life, you see, even as I read it again, I'm like, yeah, now I see the wisdom in that I didn't see before. But one of the things he says, and this is important, things always change, and they're never the same. And in the midst of all of this change, you are to seek the unchangeable God, which I think is so important, and focus on God in the midst of constant change in your life. He says, continue to point to the love of God, knowing that whether we live or die, whether we're the Lord's, nothing can separate us from the love of God. So it doesn't matter in the end to the devout person what is going on in one's life, because it will constantly go on. And today you'll be happy, tomorrow you'll be sad, today you'll have this, tomorrow you won't have it. It doesn't matter, because your heart is set on God anyway. So you remain steadfast in the endless change, in the changes that are part of natural life all the time. People come in and out of our lives. You let them in, you let them out. You say goodbye to them when it's time to say goodbye. And it doesn't matter in the end. All right? And I think and what we're going to move into is, if you have that as a basis, then and the reason why he sets that up is that things like consolation and desolation in the spiritual life are not that important as people want them to be. Because it doesn't matter, you will change. And today you will experience great, beautiful things of God, and tomorrow you won't feel anything about God. You go to Mass. And this is hard. I mean, even when I was talking to the men about this in the men's group on Saturday morning, this idea of going to Mass. Now, I celebrate sometimes a shock, right? I celebrate 4 Masses on a weekend when I have the 5 o'clock here. By the 5 o'clock, I'm just happy to be there, right? Because it's my 4th one, right? And I know that the people in there, it's their first one. But I don't have all the warm fuzzies of a Mass, right? And they're like, oh, and I'm like, look, I'm saying this for you guys. It doesn't have the same effect as the first Mass of the weekend, right? But I'm not running after what it does for me. It's not about me. And Mass isn't about you and what you get out of it, as I often say, because you may get nothing out of it. For 5 years you go to Mass and you get nothing out of it. But it doesn't matter, because you're not running after consolations and desolations. Unless, of course, for you, religion is a drug, and what you need to do is constantly have a religious high. And if you constantly have a religious high, then each next experience has to outdo its prior experience for you to have that high. And that's why we say, Mass is not entertainment. They're like, that's for sure. Have you been to it lately? Not much entertaining there. And I'm saying, absolutely, it's not meant to be entertaining. You go because that's who you are. And I celebrate Mass. And if you are running after wanting to be high all the time, just get drunk or get some drugs, and you'll be fine. You'll get what you want, right? But Mass is about something very different. It's about offering your life to God, and it's about listening to what God wants from you, and it's about being in a community, and there's a lot more, but this is not a class on Mass. But it's the same thing with prayer. People come back from a retreat, and they're high, and it's great, it's beautiful. It's God opening up a new level of spirituality in your life. But 2 weeks pass, and they're like, well, I lost my high, and so you're back to the old ways. And I'm like, so what were you? You running for? I call them retreat junkies. They run from one retreat to the next, looking for the next high. And if they don't cry, they don't feel it, they don't get this thing going on in their life, they're like, that didn't work. It wasn't that great of a retreat, because I didn't feel it. I'm like, if you're running after consolations today, it may be your fault you didn't feel it. It's not the retreat's fault, right? But it doesn't matter because I'm there because that's who I am. And that's why I think in the devout life, when you know that when you're growing in the devout life, when it matters less, kind of whether you got something out of this devout life. And that's why and this is so hard for people in today, because we're a consumerist world and we pick and choose what we want and what fulfills our need. And they're scandalized by Mother Teresa, who says that pretty much she experienced the dark night of the soul after she made her commitment. She never really felt the consolations of God. But you know what? But she still remained faithful. She talked about that with her spiritual director, and she remained faithful to God because her faith was not about those. God did that for her to move her into her vocation, and then began to purify that by saying, look, it's not about that. That's not what a relationship is. The honeymoon is over. And you know that in your own life in marriage. The honeymoon is over, and now it's about you becoming one with each other. And that was what happened at the sacrament, and now you gotta do it. And it sucks to do it, right? Because the doing of it is gonna be great moments of wonderful ecstasy, and down in the dumps, total desolation. And that's why he's talking about sadness and sorrow and depression that happens with these things. If these things control you and you don't have a handle on them, you'll never grow in the spiritual life, because all you're doing is running after your passions. And the big important thing is to not focus on the consolations, but on the consoler who gives the consolations. That's what's important. So we'll end there with a little glory be, and then we'll pick up and end in 2 weeks from now. So we do glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen.